I consider myself, well, I'm a philosopher of science. That's my job, that is my title. But I'm actually consider myself to be some sort of like philosophical anthropologist. So my role would be like this alien visiting Earth and then seeing these weird creatures called humans doing their stuff, developing beliefs, developing rituals, all sorts of things, even science. And what I try to understand is, how do they do that? Why do they do that? So I look both at science and at pseudoscience. So today I'm going to focus mainly on pseudoscience. I'll do the science talk some other time. So irrational beliefs, why do we have them? And that's an interesting question. Why? Because there is this presumption, I think a common presumption, but also in psychology and in philosophy, that we need maps to navigate our world. So we have these maps in our head, beliefs, that we use to do things with. For instance, if I want to come here, I had to look up on the app of the NS, where does my train leave? When does my train leave? When will I arrive in Maastricht? How do I get from the station to here? Important questions that I have to answer, and I can only answer them and act appropriately when I have a good idea of when exactly my train will arrive and will leave, how I have to walk here to the city to navigate myself and arrive here at this auditorium. So we need beliefs to do things with. And the strange thing with irrational beliefs is that they're wrong. And so it seems strange that people would adopt wrong beliefs because it wouldn't help them. So basically they get stuck in a rut, right? If you have like misbeliefs, irrational beliefs, then there's no way that you can act properly and navigate the world efficiently. So why then do people have irrational beliefs? Well, one popular way of looking at irrational beliefs in psychology, in philosophy, is like that they have their mental viruses. I think the metaphor has some sort of benefit. I don't think it's entirely wrong. But the idea is that irrational beliefs function like mental viruses, so that they basically go from brain to brain and infect people's brain like a disease, some sort of that. I think the metaphor is interesting because just as with viruses, in some cases, it seems that the beliefs only benefit themselves. Just as viruses only benefit their own, they do not benefit the carrier or the bearer of the virus. And to some extent, you could say that this also applies to pseudoscientific irrational beliefs. That namely, sometimes it seems that people have these beliefs only for the benefit of these beliefs and not for the people who have them. So the interests of the carrier of the virus go against the interest of the carrier. So for instance, it would be in your benefit to get vaccinated, but when you're affected with these anti-vaccination memes, you could say, these ideas that infect your brain, these viruses, then they make you act in a way that is, well, that basically goes against your interests. But the interesting thing is that since it is good for us to have rational beliefs, it's better for us to avoid having them. And so this means, basically, well, that we're not that gullible. This metaphor of a virus seems to imply that our minds get easily infected with these viruses. But apparently, well, we're pretty good at, well, being critical. And so I'm going to explain it a little bit further on, because I see, what do you mean? I'll explain it in a minute. But it seems that people, well, are not vulnerable to all sorts of irrational beliefs, but that these beliefs have to develop strategies to overcome our critical stance. So this is, I base this idea on an important paper that has been published in 2010. There were a couple of co-authors. The first author was Dan Sperber, who is a cognitive anthropologist and a philosopher. And they argue that, well, people are not gullible, they're not stupid. Instead, we can expect them to be what they call epistemically vigilant. So epistemically vigilant means that we're quite concerned and quite skeptical and quite critical about the sort of information that we accept from others. The reasoning behind that idea is quite simple. It takes an evolutionary perspective, and it says that communication could never get off the ground if we would not be epistemically vigilant. Why is that? Well, the reason is, if you would believe everything that I tell you, you could be easily manipulated. I can let you do whatever I want. Right? So it's in your own interest to be at least a little bit skeptical about what other people tell you. And it seems even, research suggests, that was difficult, research suggests, that people tend to be overly critical, overly skeptical, rather than gullible, when it comes to the information that they accept, which is strange. So gullibility cannot be a good explanation for why people have irrational beliefs. So we are epistemically vigilant. We check the information that we get from others. How do we do that? Well, basically in two ways. One is that we evaluate the source of the information. Who is giving me the information? Is that a competent source? Is that a benevolent source? The other thing that we check is content. We look at the content of the information that we get. What do we check? We check whether the information is consistent, sort of. And we also check whether the new information is coherent with what we already think we know. So these are some very simple, intuitive, it's not that we really think about this, but these are some intuitive checks that we do when we receive information from others. I think this is interesting because the question then becomes, on the one hand, we see that people are vulnerable, are prone to believing, to having these irrational beliefs, and on the other hand, we know that people are epistemically vigilant. So the question is, what sort of irrational beliefs then overcome this epistemic vigilance? And so the argument that I'm going to make tonight, this evening, is that they have to adopt certain strategies, you could say, from the point of view of the beliefs, in order to spread. So they have to follow some sort of recipe, strategy, that makes it more likely that they will be widely adopted, widely believed, and so become cultural. I will argue that there are three strategies for irrational beliefs to become popular, to become cultural. The first one is intuitive appeal. So the more that beliefs are intuitively appealing, the more likely that they will become widely spread. The other one is science mimicry. So basically, adopting the trappings of science to create a trustworthy image. Finally, I will also argue that irrational beliefs can become popular because they serve social functions. So they are not adaptive in response to our natural environment, but they are very rational, very adaptive when we look at them from a social perspective. And they seem to make more sense. Okay, let me start with intuitions and emotions. Do you feel it? So when the intuitions and emotions, according to psychology, it seems that intuitions and emotions play a very important part in our psychology, in our mind. So humans tend to think of themselves as rational creatures, that we can make choices, balancing the pros and cons, for instance, if we want to buy a car, that we check all the benefits, we check all the disadvantages, and then we weigh up the different cars that we could buy, and then we eventually buy the car. But apparently, that's not how human psychology works. Human psychology mainly works on the basis of hunches, intuitions, emotions, and we decide on the basis of that, whether we like a car or not, for instance. Does it have a nice color, right? Things like that. So intuitions and emotions, I use this spider example because we know that people can get very easily scared from spiders. This is an inclination that we have that seems to be innate. And we can explain that inclination because, of course, we can expect in an ancestral environment that spiders form a serious threat for our survival, so that we have some kind of specialized mechanism that says when we see a spider, be careful, do not touch. Now, even today, people here in the Netherlands, also in Belgium, I can attest to that, there are people, when they see the smallest spider, they start screaming and jump on the table. Ah, spider, 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 right? And then you have to come to the rescue, take that little spider and throw it out of the window. Big hero, huh? But why do we have that? Because it is irrational, especially in the Netherlands and Belgium, to have this fear of spiders, especially of these small spiders, because we have no poisonous spiders here, venomous spiders. So it doesn't seem to make sense, right? Why do we have it? Well, we can understand why we have the intuition, because it makes sense from the fact that earlier on, spiders posed an enormous threat to our survival, but not anymore. But the mechanism is still there. So it still makes us vulnerable to this sort of information. So this is my first point. Intuitions and emotions, they make us receptive, more attentive to, more interested in certain forms of information. They push certain buttons in our brain that our brain really likes, like, oh yeah, like candy for the brain. Please give me. Right? And this is, I think, what irrational beliefs do. So this is the first strategy. How does that relate to epistemic vigilance? Well, I told you that one of the things that we check is to what extent information coheres with our priors, right? What are important forms of priors? Intuitions and emotions. They give us hunches, basic ideas of what the world is like. And so cultural information that aligns with these expectations, well, they're more satisfying. They push the right buttons in our brain. So the idea is indeed, and this also builds on a model developed by Dan Sperber from the Epistemic Vigilance paper called Cultural Epidemiology, so that beliefs spread within groups of people, and the beliefs that are intuitively appealing, that manage to push our intuitive buttons, they stand a bigger chance of becoming widely spread, to become cultural. That's the main idea. We also see that intuitions and emotions are often oversensitive. So they are prone to overreact, you could say. So they react to cues that somewhat resemble the original cues, but they're not. So it's not an adequate response. I will give you some examples later on. But that, of course, makes it plausible that these intuitions and emotions sort of misfire, you could say. They become active even in circumstances when they shouldn't. Just as, for instance, with the spider example. You should not really be scared of very small spiders. Even the people who have these fears know that, but nevertheless, the intuition is there, and it's very difficult to overcome, very difficult to ignore. Okay. Oh. Yes. Oh, God. Patience. Yes. So one of the intuitions that I want to talk about here, and which is relevant for understanding at least some forms of irrational beliefs, is the notion of psychological essentialism. Yeah, it's a strange image, I know, but it's to illustrate the point of psychological essentialism. So let me first go to the next slide, because there is a little bit of explanation of what it is. So it is like an intuitive expectation that we have when we think about organisms. So this has been researched in the United States, mainly also because of concerns with creationism. So what does psychological essentialism say? Or what is it about? It is an assumption, an intuitive assumption, so it's not a reflective thought, that organisms contain an essence. We cannot see the essence, it's invisible, but the assumption is that it's unchangeable, immutable, and that it determines the identity of the organism. So if you see a kangaroo, it is a kangaroo because there's the essence of a kangaroo inside it. And because it has that identity, that core, It determines also, for instance, how the organism will behave, how it will develop, and so on. So now let me go back to that picture of little piglets with a tiger fur. That refers to a particular experiment in which children, 5-year-olds, 5 to 7-year-olds, were asked the following thing. So it's a thought experiment. So if you have a pig, right, piglet, and you take the outside of the pig away, and you put around it the outlook of a tiger. So this is what the picture refers to, right? Is that then a pig or a tiger? And children will definitely say, no, it's a pig. So even if you change the outside, there's something about the core that determines what it is. Because if you do the opposite, and you say, okay, take the pig again, and take away the innards, whatever it is, it's a thought experiment, so don't make it too bloody in your mind. I try not to do it or I'll faint. You take the innards out and you put in the innards of a tiger. What is it then? And the children will say, it's a tiger. Right? 5-year-olds. So they have this assumption that there's something inside that cannot be touched by the outlook of an animal. There's something inside that we cannot see that determines what it is like. Also so surroundings also do not have an effect on the essence. So again, with children were asked, if you have like a goat, and it gets raised among kangaroos, will it be like a kangaroo or will it be like a goat? Oh, a goat. So whether it's been raised by or among kangaroos, it doesn't really matter. The identity that is inside determines what it is like. So that's one thing. So the interesting thing is then, if we have that literature, if you're interested, there's this wonderful book by Susan Gellman, psychologist, published in 2004 called The Essentials Child, in which she relates of that sort of research that she has been conducting on this particular topic. We can see it, for instance, in creationism. I'm very much interested in creationism because I did my PhD on creationism in Europe, and I got really interested in the cognitive foundations for why creationist beliefs are so widely spread. But in creationism, creationism is based on the idea that species do not change, basically. Well, you can have changes from wolves to dogs, for instance, but they would argue that this is still within the same kind. So this is not really change. So that's, of course, based, I think, on the notion that organisms have immutable essences that are impossible to change. How can an ape change into a human? Or an animal with 4 legs change into a whale? That's impossible. You have like these species barriers, boundaries, that cannot be crossed. So you can see, of course, why this is very interesting in the United States, because there, still 40% of the population believes in creationism. So psychologists are interested in why is that. Another example that I also studied is that of GMOs, so genetically modified organisms. Then you see there that also, in some of the opposition to genetically modified organisms, there is essentialist thinking involved. To give you some examples, it seems that in some cases, people tend to think of DNA as the essence of an organism. So it has been asked in surveys that if you modify the genome of a tomato with DNA from a fish, the question is asked, will the tomato taste like fish? And the answer is obviously no. But there's only a minority that gives the right answer. So what happens here is, of course, that people do not think in DNA in terms of DNA, but they think of it in terms of an essence. So if you take a little bit from the essence of a fish and you put it with the essence of a tomato, obviously the tomato will taste like fish. What we also see is that people are more concerned about applications that involve different species rather than you stay within the species. So there are more concerns, that's the term, about transgenic applications than cisgenic applications. So for instance, if you would modify a tomato with the genes of a fish, that's transgenic. If you would modify a potato with the genes of another potato, that's cisgenic. But from a scientific perspective, that doesn't really make any sense, because you have the same alphabet, the universal alphabet of life, namely the 4 letters of the DNA. Right? So it doesn't make any sense. And then you also see the arguments that anti-GMO adherents or opponents of GMOs use, namely that GMOs violate borders between species, or the DNA is not specific to their kind. And you get these pictures. So what happens when you modify the genome of a tomato with fish DNA? You get fish tomatoes. Or if you do the same thing with human DNA, you get these tomatoes where a human embryo grows. It was, yeah? Yeah, it has been tried. No, of course not. No. The first application of that has come on the market was in the 1990s, and these were fish that had been modified with the genome of a fish that was very strongly resistant against cold, something like that. And so that was the first commercialized application of genetic modification. Interesting thing is, they put it on the can, like saying, this has been genetically modified, like it was advertisement. In the 1990s, you could do that. Later on, a little bit more difficult. But yeah, it has happened, because you can do it, right? DNA is DNA, so you can switch things basically any way you want. But the more difficult challenge is that you want these particular traits to be transferred to. And so you have to know what kind of gene codes for, and so on, right? Okay. Yeah, there was one thing that they did, Greenpeace, at the station of Amsterdam, where they said they want to make your salad more crispy by putting scorpion DNA into your salad. Okay. But if you know about essentialist thinking, then it makes sense, right? Because then you have like 2 essences that become combined, and they create this hybrid thing. Okay. Then there's this other intuition that we have, namely teleological thinking. This is some very interesting research that has been conducted at the University of Boston by Deborah Kellerman. What she has shown is that we have a natural inclination to explain events, things in the world, by means of their function or their purpose. So teleological refers to the Greek word for goal, telos, something that we can find in Aristotle, where we can find like the teleological cause of things. So what the things are for. We do not use that explanation anymore, except for a little bit in biology when we talk about adaptations, but then we have to be careful. But it seems that this teleological thinking seems like a very natural thing to do. So I use this very simple picture of this rain cloud. But the idea is that why does rain exist? The idea that it exists to water the plants seems like a very intuitive idea. Not to us anymore. Why not? Because we have unlearned it. Well, we have been trained to suppress it, let me say it like that. It's still there, but we have learned to suppress it and to think about these events in natural terms. Children do not think in these terms. So I like these experiments, these tests. So what has Kellerman done? So in one study, she asked children, well, why do you think rocks are like pointy? They have like things sticking out. And so they get several scenarios to explain that. One is the completely natural explanation, like we would accept, right? Just natural causes. One of the other explanations is that they are pointy because they want to avoid animals to sit on them. You laugh, but that's what children like. That's what they think, oh yeah, sure. That explains it. Huh? Now, we know that we still have it. We know that we laugh because we know it's not really the case. But some experiments have shown that even when you're well trained in science, that you are still vulnerable to this way of thinking. How do they test that? Well, they put people under time pressure. You have to answer quickly, which means that you do not get the time for your mind, in your mind, to suppress it. And so you say or you answer in the way that you first think the way it is before you can suppress it. And what happens? Even with physicists, they return to this sort of explanation. The same happens with people with Alzheimer, so certain brain areas that are no longer functioning properly, and so they cannot suppress that intuition. We also see it in uneducated adults. So there's quite a bit of evidence that this seems like some sort of natural stance that we have, the teleological stance. And then, of course, we as humans, as a social species, when we think in terms of what are things for, functions, purposes, what do we link with purposes? If we look at an artifact, well, it has a purpose. And what can we tie that purpose to? Well, someone intended this object to have that function. So we see that this teleological thinking often gets intertwined with intentional thinking, so that we understand these purposes of things in terms of the intentions of some sort of intentional being, as we can find, for instance, in all sorts of religions. So we also do it in our so intentional thinking, as it says here, means that we explain things in terms of mental states, of beliefs, of desires, intuitions, fears. And we also still do it intuitively, very rapidly, when we get frustrated, for instance. When we're writing a paper, we're almost finished, and our computer crashes. You damn thing, you did this on purpose. No, it didn't, because it doesn't know what it's doing. Same with the car, you want to go on a holiday, your car breaks down. You become angry with the car, which is strange because it doesn't really know what it's doing. It's not a person that you can get angry with. So here again, sorry to go back to the modification of GMOs, but I know this quite well. But we can see this teleological intentional thinking also reoccurring in GMO opposition. Obviously, we also see it in creationism, right? Where God the Father has created everything with a certain design, with a certain purpose, and that is the way that we account for the creation, for all life on it. But here in Anti-GMO, it's not like God the Father, but it's more Mother Nature. Mother Nature provides. Mother Nature provides, and so we should not thwart the plans of Mother Nature. We should not interfere with that. Otherwise, scientists are messing with nature, with the way that Mother Nature intended it. And we see it in the arguments. They argue that scientists are playing God, that there is Frankenfood. So basically, if we ourselves make things in nature, well, then it doesn't work out the way that Mother Nature intended it. So we get things like this, Frankenfood, things stitched together, artificial food. Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's for later. That things are unnatural, which doesn't make any sense, and it's not the result of natural selection, as if natural selection was a process that intended things in some way. As I hope you know, natural selection is completely blind and has no intentions whatsoever. So we also see it pop up in conspiracy theories. It's still there, right? Yeah, okay. So one very popular one was that Bill Gates had manipulated the vaccines with some sort of chip that was then inserted in your body so that people could track you. So this is, of course, conspiracy theory, that are also very appealing because it taps into this intentional thinking. For us humans, thinking in terms of other people's mental states is very, very, very appealing. It's very nice for us, for our brain to do. So obviously, when you have an explanation, a natural explanation, that often might not feel satisfying. There's this famous example in anthropology where an anthropologist is sitting with some people of a local culture, and a cabin falls down, and there are some people inside them. And when they look at the structure of the cabin, then they see that it's full of termites. So you would say, we have a good explanation for why it collapsed. Termites. But that was not the interesting question. The interesting question is, why did it collapse at the exact point when these people were there? And then, of course, witches, ancestors, right? So here, again, intentional thinking is, whoa. To us, social species is the main interest. We can see the same thing with believing ghosts. Still very popular. I think among sometimes 40% of the people who participate in a survey respond that they believe in ghosts, so it's quite large. But of course, you can see here, there are some events, some strange noises in the house, and people quickly infer, this must be a ghost. No. Why? We know that, for instance, old houses make weird noises. So that should suffice as an explanation. But it doesn't. We think that there is some dark, intentional being present that has bad plans with us. Right? That's interesting. So we see that this sort of ideas, these beliefs, that they spread because they appeal to our intuitive, intentional thinking. One more, ufology. So that there are agents with intentions, bad intentions, who come down to Earth and abduct people and conduct all sort of strange experiments on them. So here again, this is very appealing that these agents are here and have these bad intentions. I'm very insecure about this mechanism. I see, no, it's not. I do not have the touch, apparently. One more thing. So here I talked about intuitions. I also want to say a little bit about an emotion, namely disgust. As you can see here with the picture, disgust, like when you see something that's very unpalatable, and the very idea of consuming it, like very big worms or something like that, you already feel it in your stomach. Like, I'll stop giving examples. So why do we have disgust? Well, the idea that psychologists have is that it is some sort of protective mechanism. It's like a first defense wall against possible contamination by pathogens. And once they are entered, we also have a system that sometimes knows how to deal with pathogens, but it's of course better not to consume them. So what disgust does is to help us avoid the consumption of pathogens. It's what we could call some kind of intuitive microbiology. It detects, without us knowing what we're doing, it detects like this presence of the little animals that could make us sick. And even when we consume it, we immediately go, we want to get rid of it. That's why the expression comes from. So disgust also functions on a better safe than sorry strategy. It's oversensitive, as I said in the start of the presentation, which is also exploited in some very nice psychological experiments. I will give you 2 examples. In one example, psychologists presented the participants with a cookie that was shaped in the form of a feces. Enjoy. You feel it? So most people are not very likely to eat it, even though they know it's chocolate, which is in the shape of a feces. I'm not going to touch that. In another experiment, psychologists took a bowl of orange juice. They take a toilet brush, brand new, still in the package, so completely sterile. They open the package, they stir. They stir in the orange juice, they pour a glass, and they say, here you go. Sorry? But that would be a good explanation for what but it doesn't. It doesn't become brown. So it's still the same color, and they know it's sterile, but nevertheless it has touched a toilet brush, so we're not gonna drink it. So because it can become so easily elicited, it's good for irrational belief to do the same thing, because that makes it appealing, because it poses a threat. So our brain goes, uh-oh, I better pay attention to this. And if possible, I can also communicate it to others so they think of me as an interesting informant. So this is how the information then spreads. It has been investigated, for instance, urban myths that contain elements of disgust become more popular than urban myths that don't. We see the same thing, again, with GMO, where people seem to think of the modification as the contamination of the essence of an organism. So with the modification, you do something wrong, you contaminate it, you make it bad. So we see that in the fact that the strongest opposition to GMOs are in food applications, that people think that people put into the mouth. They're less concerned, for instance, about the fact that insulin comes from genetically modified bacteria. People have no problem with that, but they have problem with food applications. And then also the arguments that GMOs are poisonous, that they cause allergies, sterility, cancer, all sorts of bad things. Also that they contaminate the surrounding fields and so forth. So this disgust language pops up quite frequently in anti-GMO opposition. And also with anti-vaccination. So anti-vaccination is, you could say, an intuitively, but it builds on the intuition of disgust or pathogen aversion, because what happens with vaccination, you put basically a pathogen into your body. Right? In order, of course, to make the body stronger, to build up immunity against it. But the first thing is, of course, that you put it inside your body. So people are like, really? You're going to put that in my body? No way. Huh? So it's understandable, because it relates to possible contamination, so people try to avoid it. Okay, so this is for the intuitively appealing part, and now I have 20 minutes for the rest. But we're good. So the other strategy is what I think is science mimicry. Because we live in a cultural environment in which science is considered to be a reliable epistemic authority. If we want knowledge, if we want information, who do we turn to? Who are you going to call? The scientists. Huh? Right? So if science is such a reliable authority that we consider basically without much asking or without much criticism, because we assume that it's trustworthy, then of course it makes sense for people who adhere to irrational beliefs to dress them up as scientific. So how can you do that? Well, we see that, for instance, within creationism, that creationists, when they write books, that they boast their academic credentials. So, yeah, this book was written by Michael Behe, PhD. So I'm a PhD, so you better listen. Right? The only thing is that they often write about a domain in which they do not have a PhD. Right? But it works. Why does it work? Because, well, the people that they address have similar ideas. So they do not really have to be convinced, but it's nice for them to have like a scientific person say the things that they appreciate. So they can say, well, but that scientist said it. Right? So it gives like the proper justification for holding these beliefs within a society, a culture that has a very high regard of science. Right? You can say, it is scientific. Right? That person with the PhD says it is. Another thing that they try to do is to get articles in scientific journals. There's this very famous, unfortunately, famous paper by Andrew Wakefield that was published in The Lancet, one of the major journals, or I think the biggest journal in medicine, that showed a link between vaccines and certain vaccines and autism. The experiment, or the study was completely a mess, but nevertheless it was published in The Lancet somehow. And now it has been withdrawn. The Lancet has distanced itself completely from it, but still, anti-vaccination people keep on referring to it. Of course, obviously, it's a paper in the Lancet, so it's good. The complex terminology, they use words like, for instance, irreducible complexity. You tell me what it is. But they just want to impress people with scientific-sounding vocabulary to create the impression that you're dealing with the real stuff. Formula. Include formula, that's a good idea to come across like a scientist. In one study, they inserted formula into a completely nonsensical paper. And there was a difference in, I must say, between scientists and people who were working in the humanities and the social scientists. And the second group was, well, especially in the humanities, they were a lot more impressed with the fact that there was a formula there. So they thought, okay, this must be great because there's a mathematical formula there. Of course, the scientists were not impressed. They said, it's nonsense. But it seems though people working in the humanities fall for it, so we can assume that, well, lots of people in the larger public would also fall for it because we're not properly trained in mathematics. But just the fact that there is a formula there seems to give the impression that it is scientific. Yes?
The reason I found for is that you said that people are very critical.
Yeah?
And all these examples that you were setting, people are not critical. And I think that is a setting where you need to be especially critical.
Right. It's a good thing that you pointed out. So the question is, I'll repeat it for the people in the back. So the question is, I seem to be giving the assumption here that people are not critical, whereas I said from the start that they were critical. It's good that you mentioned that, because that is something that I forgot to mention. Namely, that we saw that there were two ways for epistemic vigilance. One was the content, and we saw that, well, one way to overcome epistemic vigilance towards the content was to be intuitively appealing, because they align with our priors. Here we have the other epistemic vigilance. Namely, we look at the credibility of the source. So if you can pretend to be like a credible source, you seem to adopt the right traffics to convey that image. That's at least the idea. So we're not gullible, but we think that we are dealing with real science because it has, well, people pretend to be, their pseudoscience to be real science. That's the idea. And that's basically because we're vigilant, that is the strategy that these adherents have to adopt. Otherwise, they could just say anything. No, they have to find ways of making their irrational beliefs more credible. That's the idea.
But then, does being critical mean only being critical when the information does not seem gullible, or always being critical?
What was the first part? I didn't understand.
Like being critical, does
Yeah?
it apply to cases that are not gullible or that are not easy to believe, or does it apply like you're always critical about everything?
Well, our stance, our default stance seems to be that we're overly critical. So research suggests that we trust people less than we should even. Yeah. So that's weird, right? So, because if we're so critical, then why do we all have these irrational beliefs? And so I think one is because some are intuitively appealing, so they overcome our epistemic vigilance in that way. Others are then present themselves as credible, and they adopt the signals of science, and that it works because people do not have a proper understanding of science, for why science deserves why we rely on it so much. And if you don't have that understanding, then of course you just go by the looks of science to decide who am I going to trust, and then of course it pays off for irrational beliefs to adopt, to pretend to mimic science, to pretend to be science. That's the way that I think it could work. Okay? And also, for instance, to include bibliography with long references, preferably references to standard works in science, to give the impression that you're dealing with a scientific discussion. Other strategies are, for instance, that they create the impression that there is a scientific controversy going on. So creationists, for instance, also, they just love being invited for discussions with proper biologists. Why is that? Because then they can convey the impression that there are two equal viewpoints that are now having a debate. But it's not fair, right? You should actually have like 1,000 evolutionary biologists and then one creationist biologist. And then, even still then, I think the balance would be off, right? So by creating this idea, there is this scientific controversy. They also give the impression that you're dealing with a proper scientific viewpoint that is still being discussed. And now I want to turn to the final strategy, you could say, that explains why irrational beliefs become widely spread, and this is something that I have become more interested in recent years, is that irrational beliefs, they do not satisfy epistemic concerns. People do not adopt irrational beliefs because they are somehow wrong in acquiring information, acquiring the right information. No, they adopt irrational beliefs because it suits them. It suits them in their social life. So this is why, and this is a nice way of putting things by a young philosopher called Dan Williams, who published a paper on this quite recently, and he calls them socially adaptive belief. So you can have beliefs that function like maps, that have to work properly in a natural environment, that you know that there is a car coming when you're crossing the road. It's good to have these sort of beliefs. But on the other hand, there also seem to be beliefs that seem particularly suited to navigate our social environment. And when they have that function, it often pays off for these beliefs to be really weird. Yeah? I'll explain in a minute. Did I explain everything here? Yeah, so we also have to make sure, of course, that the social benefits of these beliefs outweigh the costs that potentially come with them being wrong. So one of the results is that people often have these weird beliefs about things that have no direct impact on them. Lower costs, so you can say whatever you want, right? There is no real impact on your life. So you can have these crazy beliefs. Furthermore, you get social benefits. Give some examples. Oh, God, now I'm gonna... That's, of course, not the idea of a pointer, but... These are the sort of social functions that irrational beliefs might have. So it goes from justifications, rationalizations, so already explaining or allowing you to do the things that you want to do. So you want to do a certain thing. For instance, during the Second World War, there were lots of anti-Semitics in Nazi Germany. What did the Nazis provide? Well, they gave them the justifications, all kinds of conspiracy theories about Jews, to allow them to do the things that they already wanted to do, namely get at the Jews. Right? That was the idea. So they give them some sort of justification for letting them do the things that people already want to do. How do we know that, for instance? Well, in Germany, it seems that the propaganda of the Nazis only worked in those areas in Germany where there was already quite a bit of anti-Semitism. Where did it fail? To the great frustration of Goebbels, who wrote about this. This is not working. Well, in the areas where there was no anti-Semitism. So people were not convinced by the Nazi propaganda, but people took the Nazi propaganda when they suited their own anti-Semitic interests, when they provided the ammunition to get at the Jews. That was the idea. So I think this is even more worrying than the idea that propaganda works, because it's basically a market idea. You provide the belief that people will buy. So people are willing to buy this. This also applies to Donald Trump. People are not convinced by Donald Trump. Donald Trump says the things that people like. How do you deal with that? Okay, so other functions are signaling of group membership, also distinguishing yourself from other groups that you do not want to be associated with. Very important. We're a social species, so these things are really important to us. Emphasizing in-group, out-group distinctions, as I mentioned, shaping coalitions. Who is with me? Who is against me? We use irrational beliefs to do that work for us. Okay, you say stupid things, I also say these stupid things. right? I know where to find you. You know where to find me. If you want to hurt somebody else, let's get together, right? Social coordination, same thing, but less coalitional, but that we can coordinate within certain groups. If we have vicious plans, that I know, okay, I can talk to you. We can work a little bit about the schemes. And we have like these weird beliefs. Nobody knows what they're about, but we have these weird beliefs, so we know what it is about. So here, for instance, in terms of justifications, we do not like the result of the elections, so they're stolen. Very absurd claim. There is no evidence whatsoever that the elections had been stolen. But it's good to say these things, right? Because you disagree that the other group wins. So if you don't want the other group to win, you start saying these things. And when you say these things, you provide some sort of justification for yourself, but also the group that you belong to. Well, that you're not allowed to. Yeah, now you can charge the White House, right? The elections have been stolen. That's one thing. Here, Putin arguing that Ukraine is full of Nazis. It's not true, obviously. Quite possibly, Putin knows it's not true. I hope so. I'm not sure. But he uses the fact that Ukrainians have to be denazified as a justification. It's completely wrong. But he uses it as a justification to invade Ukraine. I have to fight the Nazis, just as we did in World War II. As I said, it's good to have not just irrational beliefs, but to have like really, really weird beliefs, really bizarre, absurd beliefs, as flat earthism, for instance. Quite a few people, especially in the United States, who have these kind of beliefs. Also, for instance, that you can maintain that there were more people at the inauguration of Donald Trump with his first presidency than at the inauguration of Obama. Republicans who keep on repeating that. Here's the evidence. It clearly shows that this is not the case. Right? But if you want to be known as a credible adherent of Trump, you just keep on repeating that claim. And this makes you a reliable adherent of Trump, because you show to your own group that you are willing to adopt the craziest belief, to say the darnest thing even in the face of evidence. No, there were still more people at Trump's inauguration than at Obama's. Same thing with flat earthism. It's so absurd. But you show to other people by adopting these sorts of beliefs that you are willing to burn your bridges with the mainstream. You are not happy with how things go in the mainstream culture, and so you adopt your own narratives, and you adopt really bizarre narratives just to show that you're willing to blow up any bridges with the mainstream, any bridges with the mainstream, and so basically you put your reputation at risk as a rational person. And this signal is so strong, because reputation is so important to us humans, what other people think of us, that you say, I don't care anymore. I so want to be with this group, with this fringe group, that I'm saying these crazy stuff. Identification with the group. Here we have a senator in the American Senate who came up in front with a snowball. This senator was a Republican, or perhaps still is, I don't know. He was a Republican. And he said, it is now snowing in my state, so it's very cold. How can there be climate change? Very bad argument, as you can see. But basically, that's the point. You're willing to make this claim just to indicate what a strong, believing Republican you are. Just as you would wear stripes to indicate what sort of football club you support. So you wear these like painting on your face to say, look, I'm a Republican and I don't believe in climate change. And I'm willing to use the stupidest argument that is available. So, just in time. So my conclusion is, I hope to have perhaps convinced you a little bit, even though you're very epistemically vigilant, I know, that people are not stupid. They're not gullible, but they are indeed epistemically vigilant. So we have this mechanism. I could not really elaborate on that, but the point is we have these mechanisms. And so if we want to explain irrational beliefs, we have to take that into account. Why are these irrational beliefs there, even though we seem to be epistemically vigilant? How do they get around that? So I've argued that there are three ways in which irrational beliefs do that. One is they're intuitively appealing. Second is they mimic science. Third is they can be socially adaptive. Right? And that's my argument. Thank you for listening.